I will now give you concrete examples of how EU relations with Africa works. There is not a one-size-fits-all description of how EU foreign policy towards Africa is done. In an idealised model, the European External Action Service acts as a coordinator, receiving the input for the line on foreign policy from the member states in the Council. The Commission manages EU aid and leads on several policies, including trade relations. The European Parliament has a monitoring and oversight role, notably on the way that the EU spends its money. It can influence decisions and hold the other institutions to account. And then we have the European delegations, which are the face of the EU in Africa. I will now give you two examples of how policy processes play out in reality. The first example is programming of EU aid for a sub-Saharan African country. This example aims to give an overview of the political dynamics at play, rather than explain step by step the programming process. For that we have briefing note number 54, which is available on the ECDPM website. So, at the start of a new budget cycle, the EU has new money in the European Development Fund available for development cooperation with African countries and regions. For each of them, the EU needs to decide how it will spend its aid money from the EDF. To do that, DG DevCo and the European External Action Service send programming instructions to the EU delegations in African countries. In the delegation, it is the operations section, which is made up of DevCo staff, that does the programming. The input of the External Action Service varies, and sometimes it's absent. The EU delegation will talk with the government, civil societies, local actors, European states' embassies and other donors to understand their priorities. The consultations with the government are important for ownership of programming by the African partner. The EU member states' embassies have to be consulted, but they do not make a joint decision on the allocation of money. Another challenge in this phase is that the involvement of the civil society can often come too late in the process to be meaningful. The proposal is then sent back to headquarters for approval after internal consultations. Here, there can be a challenge. Sometimes there is a mismatch between the priorities imposed by the EU and those of African states. Once agreed in Brussels, the programming document needs to be finalised in agreement with the government of the country and signed by the government, usually by the Minister for Development or a similar position. So let's move to the second example, the adoption of conclusions by the Council. When there is a crisis in a country, such as the events in Mali, Central African Republic or Egypt, the European External Action Service monitors the situation through its EU delegation. The EU member states discuss the case in the Council at the level of Political and Security Committee. They might decide to state an EU position on that case, which is stated in Council conclusions. Member states with an historical legacy with the concerned country are usually very vocal. There are no Council conclusions that are not reflecting their interests. The European External Action Service chairs the meetings and has to find a compromise text. The conclusions are then adopted by the Foreign Affairs Ministries in the Foreign Affairs Council, and they are published on the Council's website. The High Representative usually then holds a press conference where she presents the conclusions.